A geopolitical confrontation is unfolding between the Netherlands and China, and it's threatening to bring European car manufacturing to a grinding halt. In the final days of September, a decision made quietly in The Hague sent tremors rippling through the interconnected global economy. Dutch authorities announced they were seizing operational control of Nexperia, a Chinese-owned semiconductor manufacturer responsible for producing millions of tiny but absolutely critical chips that power everything from automobiles to smartphones to electrical grid infrastructure. Government officials positioned this intervention as essential for protecting national security interests, but almost no one anticipated just how extensive the consequences would become. For the first time since 1952, the Netherlands activated an obscure Cold War-era statute called the Goods Availability Act, legislation that grants the government extraordinary authority to commandeer private enterprises during national emergencies. Within mere hours of the announcement, Beijing's position crystallized with unmistakable clarity. Chinese leadership viewed this takeover as nothing less than economic warfare disguised as regulatory action. Beneath the carefully crafted diplomatic statements lay an undeniable reality. This represented a direct assault on one of China's most significant technology investors, operating within European territory. The maneuver did more than simply damage bilateral relations. It laid bare just how vulnerable and interconnected global manufacturing networks have become. From automobile assembly plants scattered across the European continent to electronics manufacturing hubs throughout Asia, the disruption began propagating outward like shockwaves. And as both governments hardened their positions, what initially appeared to be a straightforward legal action concerning a single semiconductor company rapidly evolved into something far more consequential. A confrontation that now jeopardizes the very foundation of Europe's industrial economy. The seizure that shattered normalcy. When Dutch government officials moved against Nexperia, relatively few observers grasped just how unprecedented this intervention truly was. The company, headquartered in the Dutch city of Nijmegen, operates under the ownership of Wingtech Technology, one of China's dominant semiconductor investment firms. On September 30th, the Netherlands formally invoked the Goods Availability Act, Cold War legislation originally drafted in 1952 that empowers the state to assume control of privately held companies when national security concerns are deemed sufficiently severe. This marked the first instance in the law's entire 7-decade history that it had ever been activated. Government officials justified the action as necessary for safeguarding Europe's semiconductor supply infrastructure. However, the timing invited considerable scrutiny and speculation. Washington had spent recent months applying sustained pressure on allied governments to restrict Chinese technology firms' access to Western markets and supply chains. Dutch authorities additionally cited alleged internal governance failures within Nexperia's operations, including supposed misappropriation of approximately $200 million in company assets by senior leadership. Beijing categorically rejected these allegations, characterizing them as transparent political pretexts. Chinese officials accused European governments of expropriating Chinese-owned property while acting under pressure from American diplomatic channels. For investors and industry analysts monitoring the situation, this represented a shocking escalation in economic tensions. Nexperia wasn't some marginal startup operating at the periphery of the technology sector. This was a major chip manufacturer supplying critical components for everything from automotive electronics to power management devices embedded throughout industrial systems. Overnight, a single governmental decree placed thousands of European jobs and billions of dollars in cross-border trade flows in immediate jeopardy. The message reverberating through corporate boardrooms across multiple continents was unmistakable. The fundamental rules governing international business had undergone a dramatic transformation, and before anyone in the business community could fully process what had just occurred, Chinese authorities were already formulating their countermeasures. Beijing activates its Counterstrike. Beijing's response arrived with remarkable speed and precision. On October 4th, just days following the Dutch government's takeover, China's Ministry of Commerce issued a comprehensive directive. All semiconductor exports originating from Nexperia's Chinese manufacturing facilities were immediately suspended. What had begun as a legal dispute in a European courtroom instantaneously transformed into full-scale trade retaliation. The export prohibition covered essential components including transistors, MOSFET devices, and electronic control units, the small but indispensable chips that manage everything from an automobile's anti-lock braking systems to its battery performance optimization. Within hours of the announcement, European automotive manufacturers came to a disturbing realization about the depth of their supply chain dependence. Nexperia's production facilities located throughout China handled crucial testing and packaging operations for semiconductors initially manufactured in Europe, then shipped those finished components back for final assembly into vehicles. Once those export flows ceased, the entire supply chain fractured. Production schedules required immediate revision. Engineering teams began issuing warnings that even relatively brief delays could force complete shutdowns of automobile assembly lines within a matter of weeks. The European Automobile Manufacturers Association, known by its acronym ACEA, publicly raised alarms, cautioning that this disruption could trigger production stoppages throughout the continent. Industry analysts observed that many automakers maintained chip inventories sufficient for merely 3 to 4 weeks of continuous production. China's export ban wasn't merely a symbolic gesture or diplomatic posturing. It struck directly at Europe's industrial core with surgical precision. The export prohibition also transmitted an unmistakable message to policymakers in both Washington and Brussels. If Western governments demonstrated willingness to seize Chinese-owned assets, Beijing possessed the manufacturing leverage to retaliate with equal force. As shipping containers accumulated in Shanghai port terminals and European component suppliers frantically searched for alternative sources, the confrontation began migrating from executive boardrooms to factory floors. And that's precisely when the real shock started propagating through Europe's automotive manufacturing sector. The corporate rebellion that changed everything. By late October, the situation had deteriorated into open corporate defiance. On October 23rd, Nexperia China, the company's massive operational hub in Shanghai, declared itself functionally independent from its Dutch headquarters. The announcement stunned industry analysts and shocked investors worldwide. What had started as a straightforward corporate directive had metastasized into a geopolitical standoff, with no clear resolution path. The catalyst emerged when Nexperia's European management issued orders for the immediate dismissal of John Chang, the company's veteran vice president overseeing global sales and marketing operations. The Shanghai division flatly refused to execute the directive, arguing that the termination order violated Chinese labor protection statutes and was therefore legally unenforceable within Chinese jurisdiction. In a formal public statement, Shanghai leadership declared, "This directive fundamentally breaches local labor regulations and cannot be implemented. The implications were impossible to miss." China was categorically rejecting European corporate authority over operations conducted on Chinese soil. This transcended an internal corporate disagreement. It exposed how multinational corporations are now being fragmented along national and political fault lines. Nexperia's Chinese production facilities account for approximately 70% of the firm's total semiconductor output. Yet only 30% of that production volume can currently reach international markets due to the export restrictions imposed by Beijing. Billions of dollars worth of finished semiconductors sat effectively imprisoned within Chinese borders, while European factories faced forced slowdowns or complete production suspensions. Major component suppliers immediately initiated searches for alternative semiconductor sources. Valeo SE, one of Europe's largest automotive parts manufacturers and a primary supplier to Volkswagen, BMW, and Stellantis, confirmed publicly that it had successfully secured replacement sources for 95% of the affected semiconductor components. The statement provided brief reassurance to nervous investors, but simultaneously underscored the profound uncertainty now permeating Europe's automotive sector. The Nexperia dispute no longer resembled a corporate disagreement. It had evolved into something closer to corporate mutiny. Two headquarters, two competing legal frameworks, and two national governments quietly supporting opposing sides. What originated as a political seizure in the Netherlands had transformed into a global power struggle conducted through factories, commercial contracts, and the competing legal systems that ostensibly govern them. And for Europe's automotive manufacturers, the most severe consequences were only beginning to materialize. Shockwaves cascade through Europe and Japan as the ramifications propagate through the global automotive industry with astonishing velocity. Throughout Europe and Japan, major automobile manufacturers began issuing urgent warnings. Volkswagen, Europe's largest automaker by volume, circulated an internal memorandum to employees, cautioning that the Nexperia supply disruption could imminently affect its own production operations. In view of the dynamic situation, the company stated, "We cannot exclude the possibility of production impacts in the short term." For a manufacturing conglomerate that operates more than 10 distinct automotive brands and employs hundreds of thousands of workers across multiple continents, even relatively minor supply interruptions can cascade into massive financial losses. At Volvo, Chief Executive Håkan Samuelsson acknowledged to journalists that he anticipated some manufacturing facilities would face temporary shutdowns, even though his own company hadn't yet experienced direct impact. The warning reflected broader anxiety among manufacturers who depend on Nexperia semiconductors for electronic control units, battery management systems, and critical safety components. In Germany, the nation's influential automotive industry association, the VDA, characterized the situation as serious and confirmed that its member companies had received formal notification from Nexperia on October 10th, describing a sequence of events that made it impossible to ensure reliable chip deliveries. Beyond European borders, the Japan Automobile Manufacturers Association, whose membership includes Toyota, Nissan, Honda, and Mazda, reported being informed that semiconductor shortages could severely impact global production schedules. The United Kingdom's Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders added that such supply disruptions represented the last thing the struggling sector needed amid existing pressures. For automotive manufacturers already contending with punitive tariffs, weakening consumer demand, and intensifying competition from Chinese electric vehicle producers, this new supply crisis delivered a devastating blow to industry confidence. Assembly lines that once symbolized Europe's post-war industrial resurgence now appeared vulnerable to decisions made in distant government ministries with conflicting priorities. And behind every halted shipment and delayed vehicle model, a more fundamental problem was beginning to surface throughout Europe's economic structure. Europe's automotive sector has long functioned as a symbol of the continent's manufacturing prowess, but the structural weaknesses are now impossible to overlook or deny. The Nexperia crisis brutally exposed just how dependent European production facilities have become on Chinese technology, infrastructure, and raw materials. China currently supplies approximately 90% of the European Union's rare earth element imports, minerals absolutely essential for manufacturing electric motors, battery cells, and sensor arrays. When Beijing tightened export regulations on these critical materials, shipment volumes plummeted. Exports declined 31% in September alone, according to official Chinese customs statistics. What originated as a semiconductor shortage was rapidly expanding into a comprehensive industrial squeeze, affecting multiple sectors simultaneously. The human cost is becoming increasingly stark and quantifiable. In 2024, Germany's automotive industry employed roughly 773,000 workers. Yet more than 51,500 jobs vanished within a single 12-month period, nearly equivalent to the total job losses accumulated over the previous 6 years combined. Towns and cities that once prospered through steady factory employment are now struggling to maintain basic municipal budgets. In Ingolstadt, home to Audi's primary production facilities, city officials reported an €80 million shortfall in tax revenue after automobile sales and manufacturing output declined sharply. Europe's ambitious efforts to reconstruct its own supply chains have also stumbled badly. The collapse of Northvolt in 2024 eliminated what was intended to be Europe's flagship battery manufacturing initiative, a project that had attracted billions in investment and carried enormous symbolic importance. Porsche has already abandoned its independent battery production plans entirely, declaring them economically unviable under current market conditions. Only a handful of initiatives, including Volkswagen's PowerCo Gigafactory under construction in Salzgitter and the Verkor manufacturing plant being developed in Dunkirk, are still progressing forward, though both remain years away from achieving mass production volumes. Every economic indicator now points toward the identical conclusion. Europe's industrial foundation is deteriorating more rapidly than analysts previously projected, while its primary competitors are accelerating their own manufacturing capabilities. And as dependency deepens on external suppliers, the struggle to preserve what remains of Europe's production capacity is entering a far more precarious and dangerous phase. The Nexperia confrontation has evolved beyond a simple corporate dispute or conventional trade disagreement. It represents the emergence of a new industrial Cold War, economic conflict waged through legal mechanisms, regulatory frameworks, and judicial orders rather than military confrontation. What once unfolded discreetly through trade negotiations is now manifesting openly through domestic legislation, administrative regulations, and courtroom proceedings. Both sides are systematically rewriting the rules of international commerce to protect narrowly defined national interests. The Netherlands deployed Cold War-era security legislation to seize operational control of a Chinese-owned corporation. Beijing countered by invoking Chinese labor law statutes to categorically reject European corporate authority. The specific legal instruments may differ between jurisdictions, but the underlying objective remains identical: defending sovereign control over strategic technology sectors. Observers have drawn comparisons with the Arm-China corporate split that erupted in 2022, when the local chief executive defied the British parent company and attempted to take the Chinese subsidiary public independently. However, this time national governments are directly involved from the beginning. In the Nexperia case, government ministries and diplomatic missions are quietly directing every strategic decision, transforming what originated as a corporate governance disagreement into a fundamental test of power between nation-states. Industry analysts characterize this dynamic as a form of legal warfare, where competing systems of jurisprudence are being weaponized as instruments of economic conflict. Companies caught operating between these incompatible legal systems are discovering it increasingly difficult to maintain cross-border operations. Each government is systematically tightening control over patents, technology licenses, and export authorizations, effectively redrawing the functional boundaries of economic globalization. The Cold War may have formally ended decades ago, but its methodologies are resurging, not through military alliances and ideological blocs, but through factories, commercial contracts, and the fragile legal frameworks that ostensibly govern global trade relationships. Europe now confronts a moment of profound industrial reckoning. The same manufacturing facilities that once defined the continent's post-war economic prosperity are under immense pressure to either fundamentally reinvent themselves or gradually fade into historical irrelevance. Professor Andreas Herrmann from the University of St. Gallen articulated the challenge with striking clarity. The combustion engine was Germany's ultimate competitive advantage, but this industry must undergo crisis to emerge stronger on the other side. That transformation is already underway, though the ultimate outcome remains deeply uncertain and contingent on decisions made in the coming months and years. Some companies are fighting back through aggressive innovation and technological development. In Friedrichshafen, engineering firm ZF has successfully developed an electric motor design that utilizes no rare earth elements whatsoever, relying instead on advanced electromagnetic engineering principles. It offers a compelling glimpse of how European technology might eventually evolve beyond dependency on China's mineral resource dominance. Meanwhile, Volkswagen's PowerCo division is constructing a massive gigafactory in Salzgitter, with the explicit goal of repatriating battery cell production back to German territory. In France, Vercors, supported by Renault, is preparing a similar manufacturing plant in Dunkirk designed to supply next-generation electric vehicles with domestically produced batteries. These initiatives offer cautious grounds for optimism, but they simultaneously highlight the enormous scale of Europe's competitive challenge. Matching China's vast and highly integrated supply networks will require sustained time and investment, and every month of delay translates directly into additional jobs eliminated and revenue permanently lost. The continent's industrial future now depends fundamentally on whether it can adapt rapidly enough to reclaim control over its own production capabilities before they slip away irreversibly. The question confronting Europe and the world is now unavoidable and urgent. Has Europe initiated a confrontation it lacks the industrial capacity and political will to win? The Nexperia dispute represents far more than a bilateral trade disagreement between the Netherlands and China. It functions as a microcosm of the larger forces reshaping global commerce, the collision between national security imperatives and economic interdependence, between political sovereignty and supply chain reality, between the desire for strategic autonomy and the practical constraints of industrial capability. Europe's automotive sector, once the undisputed leader in engineering excellence and manufacturing quality, now finds itself caught in a perfect storm of challenges. Accelerating deindustrialization, deepening dependency on geopolitical rivals, technological disruption from electric vehicle transitions, and intensifying competition from manufacturers who benefit from lower costs and more integrated supply chains. The decisions made in the coming months, by governments, by corporate leadership, by investors, and ultimately by consumers, will determine whether Europe can successfully navigate this transition or whether its industrial decline becomes irreversible. China has demonstrated it possesses both the will and the capability to use its manufacturing dominance as a strategic weapon. Beijing's response to the Nexperia seizure wasn't merely reactive. It was calibrated to inflict maximum economic pain, while demonstrating that China can no longer be pressured through Western legal mechanisms alone. For decades, globalization operated under an implicit assumption that economic interdependence would moderate political conflict and that commercial interests would ultimately prevail over nationalistic impulses. The Nexperia crisis suggests that assumption may have been dangerously naive. We're witnessing the early stages of a fragmented global economy, one where supply chains realign along political boundaries, where legal systems become weapons of economic warfare, and where the notion of truly multinational corporations becomes increasingly untenable. The chips that power our vehicles, our phones, our entire digital infrastructure have become the latest front line in a conflict that will define the 21st century economic order. What's your perspective on this unfolding crisis? Has Europe overestimated its leverage, or is this confrontation necessary to protect long-term strategic interests? Can European manufacturing reinvent itself quickly enough to compete, or are we watching the final chapter of its industrial dominance? Share your analysis in the comments below. And if you're following these critical shifts in the global economy, make sure to subscribe and activate notifications so you don't miss our coverage as this story continues developing. The future of manufacturing, and perhaps the future of geopolitical power itself, is being written right now.